Hello, and welcome to our session on how to accelerate software delivery while boosting stability with AI-powered change and release management. My name is Jordan Cruin. I am on our growth team here at digital.ai, and I will be your moderator today. A few housekeeping items before we get into today's presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly after today's session at digital.ai. We will have a Q&A session at the end of today's session. Please go ahead and enter any questions you might have throughout the presentation within the Q&A panel within the webinar platform. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Joe Foley, Insights Architect at digital.ai, and Neil DeBurr, Solutions Architect at digital.ai.
Thanks very much. Okay, this is Joe. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you, Jordan. We're going to cover three main items. I'm going to give an introduction to the Digital.ai platform. Digital.ai is a relatively new company with some best-of-breed elements that have been around for some time. So the overview might be valuable. And then I'm going to really get into the main content here, talking about AI-powered change failure prediction. And then my colleague Neil is going to provide us with a demonstration of how integrating change failure prediction with release orchestration actually works in real life. So moving right into it. So trends in software, enterprise software delivery. So you see on the left side, you define DevOps tools into platforms. And when you look at that jigsaw puzzle image, you can probably think about, most environments today where there are many, many different tools that are used throughout the whole DevOps lifecycle. And the key trend here that is highlighted by this Gartner quote is that there's a movement to switching from these disparate, disjointed tool chains to value stream delivery platforms, up from only 10% of organizations who use integrated platforms today. And that's really solving an issue whereby, or a host of issues associated with using all the disparate, disjointed tools, such as the lack of end-to-end visibility, as well as just the complications of managing and integrating those into a coherent tool chain. And the second key trend is about using data to improve business outcomes. As noted in the quote here from Forrester, adopting integrated VSM brings business and development leaders together to identify the right outcomes. And that's speaking to a phenomenon where many organizations are seeing that while they've adapted Agile and DevOps, in many cases, or perhaps throughout the enterprise, they're still struggling to actually realize the improved outcomes that those are supposed to achieve. And what there's a growing realization of is that part of that is just that there's a disconnect here. And although there's a lot of work being done and output being created and migrated into production at the end of the day, there's still kind of a lack of real value being generated for the business by all of that. And value stream management is both a discipline and a set of practices that really focus on using data to try to actually improve those business outcomes. And these two key trends are really what's behind the formation in 2020 of Digital.ai that consists of bringing together 5 market leaders with a collective 50 years of experience around the one goal of providing that leading software and insight-driven platform for digital innovation. And those companies include CloudNet version 1 with the enterprise agile planning, Zebia Labs with DevOps, ArcSan providing app protection, Xperitus, continuous testing, and Numerify bringing the analytics and the AI to bear. And what Digitalai has done is knit and integrated all these together into a unified platform for value delivery. So this is just a high-level overview of that platform. And at the top is the intelligence layer. And there are 4 key intelligence solutions, flow acceleration, digital AI quality improvement, change risk prediction, and service management process optimization. And I put the little arrow right where change risk prediction fits in because that's the focus of today's talk as soon as I get through the next couple points about the overall platform. So beyond the intelligence layer is the orchestration layer. And that's the integration of all those components I talked about before, the enterprise agile planning, the DevOps, application protection testing, etc. And that's integrating those together so that while you can use any one of those solutions on their own, when you use them together, you can actually use these lenses that are actually related to the intelligence layer to provide unparalleled visibility and transparency, and to get a panoramic view across the whole spectrum of the value stream. And then finally, it all rests on shared platform services such as the AI and the analytics engine, the unified analytical model, the data lake, third-party integrations, etc. So that's a quick high-level overview of the platform. Now, you may think, based on what I just said, that we're really all about only integrating data from the digital.ai solutions into these intelligence solutions like change failure prediction. But actually, we've got a long history of interoperability and integration with a wide variety of best-of-breed tools from across the whole landscape, and that is continuing. So that's not going away in any way, shape, or form. And each of the individual solutions also integrates with a wide variety of different tools, because this is an ecosystem. And really, this is key to our ability to provide value. So let's talk about change. The change management is, really facing a lot of challenges right now that can really be greatly affected and improved by using AI-powered analytics to enable data-driven strategies. So those challenges include improving productivity. How can we focus change approval board teams on the truly risky changes? We hear so many stories about multiple CAB meetings per week that go on for hours and involve dozens of people on the phone laboriously walking through a large number of non-standard changes. Achieving high reliability. So there's a huge focus on site reliability engineering. As in a digital world, right, reliability is even more important, because right now, if your systems aren't up and running, your customers and your partners are going to immediately experience that and be affected by it. So reliability is critical, and the number one challenge to reliability is change. So even though we're having such struggles with change, in fact, it's incredibly critical and crucial that we do so. And then there's the whole automation. So we've done a tremendous amount, not to just automate IT operations, but the whole value stream delivery through DevOps automation practices. And so the goal here is to really, unfortunately, what happens is that these highly automated DevOps CI/CD pipelines run into, this huge, slow, cumbersome manual CAB approval step at the very end, which is, it doesn't matter how much upstream you automate, if you still have this huge bottleneck at the tail end of the process, all that upstream automation is going to get slowed down and bottlenecked up, and not really achieve the original goal. Then there's accelerating innovation, right? So the legacy approaches to evaluating change risk and managing change risk and approval are really holding back innovation closely related to that bottlenecking that I just spoke to. And then finally, improving customer experience. This is related to the reliability in terms of if despite all of my efforts and all this tedious, heavy legacy manual review and approval of changes is not successful, as it often is not, my customers, as I alluded to earlier, are going to be directly affected. So the key here to addressing these challenges is to use all the wealth of information and knowledge that's really latent in most companies' data. Most companies are sitting on mountains of data. And as Edwards Deming said, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And unfortunately, most organizations are really struggling to make use of all that data in a meaningful manner. So change failure prediction is one key element of the larger change risk prediction solution that addresses this challenge. And it does exactly what the name implies. It predicts the likelihood that a given change is going to fail. And by failure, that could mean cause incidents in production. It could also mean fail from a failure to deploy perspective, or in that definition of failure is highly customizable. So the first step is the change failure prediction uses AI to analyze dozens of data points about historical changes, both from the service management system where the change typically resides and potentially many of these other sources. And then having looked at all that data, it identifies the top risk factors with the strongest correlation to change failure. And then, so that could have to do with a whole variety of factors, and I'll get into those in the next slide. Then, with its understanding of those top risk factors, we pointed at planned changes that are upcoming that have not deployed yet. And it tells us, okay, these are the changes that are the most risky with the greatest probability of failing based on having a lot of characteristics in common with historical changes that failed more frequently. And then also, just as importantly, here are all the changes, typically the vast majority, that don't have anything in common with failed changes in the past based on these top risk factors that have found. And these have very low probabilities of failing. And in fact, then I really just described the last step, which is predicting the probability of failure on the planned changes. And then finally, providing insights about the key risk factors that it looked at to drive that prediction. So it's not merely providing a prediction, but it's also providing information to help you understand what are the key risk factors so that you can take appropriate action, because the ultimate goal is not to stop the change, but rather to actually pause it so that you have a chance to mitigate those risk factors so you can prevent the failure and make it successful. So turning here, so I talked about risk factors, right? So what this slide is really speaking to is that there are a whole variety of factors that could influence whether a change is likely to cause incidents in production or fail in deployment. And as anybody, as all of you with experience doing this can appreciate. So those factors really start with so the analysis of those factors really starts with the information that's about the change that's in the IT service management system. And I put the star on it here because it's just one piece of the puzzle. But when we're talking about evaluating the risk of changes, it all starts with the change itself. And then there's typically a lot of rich information about the change and that can be mined from the IT service management system, often much more information and insight than many people might think. And that might include information like the change assignment group and what's their prior history, the change category, what type of a change, the CMDB, etc. And then to the extent that there's some connection with the change and all this other types of data, like data from the software development cycle, the integration and testing, the software development might tell me about how large is the change, what process and how much time was involved in developing and testing the change, how much code was changed, how many different code files or how many different modules. The integration and testing, how was it integrated? How was it tested? What was the test coverage, the results? How many bugs were identified? And then even on the far right-hand side, the customer experience, how stable or unstable is the item that I'm changing before the change, because there's a pattern that we see fairly often that unstable configuration items before the change that are experiencing outages and incidents may be further destabilized by the change. And then finally, down at the bottom here, the release orchestration layer, which really orchestrates everything that's in the first two, vertical sections here, that what we call the development and the deployment sections, orchestrates all those activities and ties them together into a unified, managed and traceable process. That's also can be a key source. So there's a lot of information, again, sitting out there in all of your tools and systems that all individually have a tremendous amount of kind of part of the story to tell that can shed light on the risk associated with the change. And again, starting with the service management system, which is where most of our customers start implementing this, just with that service management data and maybe one other system, and then over time growing from there. So what we're going to talk about today here is how you can move beyond the basic way of using this change failure prediction information, which is illustrated with this screen here, where you see the forward schedule of change, the number of changes scheduled by day based on the planned start date, how many of those are predicted by the ML algorithm as having a higher failure probability, and then being able to drill into a particular day, and then from a day into a particular change, and then to be able to see the core risk factors, the top risk factors I was talking about, that the ML algorithm is using to predict the change risk. And here you see what you see down here: group failure rates, CI alerts, CI prior changes, etc. These are illustrative examples. So every implementation of this is different, because each machine learning algorithm, the AI creates a unique set of rules and calculations to predict change failure based on the historical data from that particular customer's implementation. So these are just examples of what are some common ones that we might see, which include things that we get out of the service management system, like the group failure rates, CI alerts, CI prior changes, reschedule count, CI class, impact, as well as things we might get from another system like pre-production defects, which is, again, optional. Now, it's great to be able to go to a screen and see this, but when you've gone to the work of actually automating your DevOps processes, it's great to have this, but you still don't want to necessarily have to stop and go look at, pull up a website and look at a screen to kind of decide whether or not this change, has any risk factors that need to be mitigated before you would proceed with deploying it. And so this is where you really want to be looking at embedding this change risk prediction into your release process. And this just describes all the changes that are flowing through both the manual channels and the automated CI/CD pipelines into this big change risk assessment funnel. And the idea is that you want to be able to identify the relatively small set. This says 10 to 20%, but often it's 5% or less. The truly high-risk changes that need some sort of review and mitigation before they can deploy. And then the 80, 90, or even 95% and more changes that are truly low risk and ideally are going to be automated, auto-approved through a fast lane, and ultimately integrated directly with your release orchestration and your pipeline, so that it can be nearly instantaneous and need no cab meeting at all, whether it's a standard change, a normal change, an emergency change, what have you. And this is what my colleague Neil is going to be talking about next, is actually walking through a live working demonstration of exactly how this can work. So Neil, with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, so folks should hopefully be seeing a Digitalai release here, and we'll kind of work up to the demonstration and story about change failure prediction and change risk prediction. In some ways, mirroring how Joe walked through the concepts, we'll look at kind of orchestration fundamentals, layering intelligence on top of that, and then how we can connect the dots, in this case with an example of change enablement, but more broadly, how do we connect intelligence directly into the orchestration process? So imagine perhaps we're a team lead or a team management type role. Now, before we kind of orchestrate value streams and our work items and developments out to production, the important seed there is good agile planning and good development activities, really that kind of value creation perspective. And so even from the release kind of vantage point, we do want to understand how we're packaging up work items, how our development teams are operating, and how that's making its way out to production. And as Joe nicely highlighted, risk is not limited to a certain domain like DevOps or ITSM or Agile. Incidents and outages can't be traced back directly to a single one of those domains. When we talk about kind of real business outcomes, real business costs, and real business risks, those conversations tend to span boundaries. And so when we look at the agile kind of development perspective here, yes, this is important for having visibility and understanding about what's coming down the pipeline, but just keep in mind too, we're going to be feeding this data as early as those work items, as early as the kind of early software development, value creation activities. We're going to be feeding that data into the change risk prediction system so that we can have a holistic approach to understanding and identifying where our pockets of risk are. Now, again, as kind of maybe a team lead, we may want to dive into some details about these different work items and perhaps even go back further sort of to the backlogs and the stuff that hasn't been worked on yet, maybe at a kind of low level backlog or even higher levels. And whether that's in something like digital AI agility or another enterprise agile planning system, that's a good place to start. That's the seed of kind of these value streams. But we'll leave that as just kind of a brief introduction and reminder that that's kind of the start of these value streams and proceed right now. So as teams develop, as teams work on those work items, we're collecting data about what's happening, which will then be interpreted by the AI ML system to understand risk. When we shift right a little bit, we're going to take another vantage point on value streams. Now, this is a little bit more of sort of an operations or an ITSM type perspective on value streams, but still this same concept of flow, which is central to the idea of orchestration and what we often call value stream orchestration. So this flow, though, instead of seeing how packages are progressing out, we're going to look now at changes. We're going to look now at kind of those operations activities and the releases and gain an understanding of our value streams from that perspective. So in this case, we see across the top here some high-level stages about how our changes are progressing out and the releases that they're connected to. Let's jump into a specific release now, where we can see more of the nuts and bolts about how we're orchestrating and how we're going to connect that up to intelligence systems, visibility, and reporting. So I've jumped into this failed release here, which was kind of emphasized on that last view, and something we should probably apply our attention to as something that's falling behind and is failing. And in this case, we proceeded through some development activities, again, collecting data in multiple ways for multiple purposes as we progress through. And we're stuck at a failed QA deployment here. Now, in this case, I've actually worked with the engineer to identify this issue and have been told that this is a networking issue and we can restart these deployments and as long as it proceeds, we should be fine. So I'll restart that QA deployment. Now, this release here, this is instantiated from templates in release. When we talk about orchestration, fundamental to that concept is having a templatized approach, having a defined process about how you take those value creation activities and connect them to end customer outcomes. Connect them to those production deployments where you're actually getting value in the hands of customers. When you have a defined, concrete pattern for how you do that, you're fundamentally going to be able to move in a higher velocity way. You're going to be able to deliver with higher quality. And of course, it touches on things like security and compliance as well. Really across the board, a well-defined, concrete process for how you deliver value is crucial. And then with Digital AI release here, you can instantiate releases from that. And that's what we see here, where we have completed tasks and this release progressing through a number of phases. We've taken the template, that plan for how we're going to deliver value, and instantiated a release from that, so we can actually deliver that value. So we can move those bits and bytes and not just have that integration and automation, but also some higher level details as well, like process controls, like security and compliance, the GRC activities, certainly change enablement. There are a number of dimensions to this. And so we want to bring that all together with our releases here and with orchestration. Now we'll get to the cab phase here in just a moment, where we'll get to drill into some of these concepts about taking a data-driven and really AI-driven approach to cabs and change enablement. But let's pause just very briefly, a little pit stop on our way there with this manual testing task, where we have now some security folks and QA folks who are tasked with looking at this application and making sure that this passes their scrutiny. And even though that's a seemingly pretty regular activity that I'm sure many folks are accustomed to, and may seem like business as normal, this is also something that we want to bring intelligence into. So while we'll focus on change enablement and kind of the orchestration and intelligence that we talk about today, you can think about this much more broadly. And so things like QA, things like security activities, bring context, bring reporting, and bring intelligence into that as well, so that you can have the benefits of a data-driven approach really across the board, right? This is one example. We'll go more into the change enablement one as well, but it's an important concept across the board. And so for more of a practitioner type role, they may jump into views like this, where we can see recent automated test results, how long those took to execute and the results. And it looks like we had a couple tests get hung up, I should say. So maybe we want to click into that and double click into that, so to speak, and understand what happened, right? Understand why this was incomplete, or maybe a failed test as well. And perhaps watch the video from a mobile testing lab, for example, on why that test failed. We can also complement that with higher level reporting as well, where we think about release quality risk, for example, and think about, from the quality perspective now, kind of where are our pockets of risk and how are we performing. So I won't go into too much detail on that, but I just wanted to highlight that this principle of connecting intelligence to orchestration spans boundaries, whether those are domain boundaries, whether those are organizational structure boundaries, perhaps even organization boundaries, and is a principle that you can apply to a number of areas in the software development lifecycle. So I'll complete these two manual tasks so we can proceed on to the kind of core concept here of the change enablement vantage point. All right, and now as our release proceeds, a few things have happened in the cab phase here. So first off, we've pulled a value, pulled a risk prediction value from our change risk prediction solution. In this case, that's going to be a value of 0.18, and we see the factors that led up to that. In just a moment, we'll go into some analytics views to dive into that in more detail, similar to what Joe alluded to in his introduction. But note we get a little bit of information about specifically why we had that risk value. Importantly, though, we automate this. We bring this from the analytics layer, kind of the data platform, into the orchestration layer and drive process with that. How do we do that? Well, we apply that risk prediction value of 0.18 to some criteria that are going to form the basis for our decision about the cab. That is, we're going to set some not only data and ML type criteria for whether we should have the cab or not, but also some just business process kind of control checks as well. And I've set up a simple example here where we can think about, first the risk prediction value has to be less than 0.03, or else we just have to do the cab. And so that's kind of a threshold type approach. However, we also combine that with a couple concrete checks, right? So we think about maybe we can't have failed tests, or else it needs the cab. Certain smoke tests need to pass, let's say. We also may have some automated compliance checks, for example, and that's a non-negotiable. If those are failing, then we also need to apply the cab process, the manual process. In this case, we did meet those kind of business process checks, but we did not meet that risk prediction value. We had a little bit too high on that risk prediction, so we do have to have the cab meeting. Now, what I've walked through is really transparent to the practitioner and management folks alike. You don't have to understand machine learning AI principles to be able to follow this orchestration and help it along where there are manual tasks in the process. For a practitioner coming into this particular orchestration, this release, they just see we need the cab meeting. So this would have automatically passed if we had met those checks. So no need to dive into certain details or understand the underlying data or ML models, certainly anything like that. Folks just see that we need the cab, and that's been a data-driven and business process-driven decision. Now, all is not lost, even though we have the manual cab, and in fact, that's what we want. We know this risk this change has a high risk, and so we want the cab. That's exactly what we want. We want to apply our valuable resources. Cabs can be very expensive, so we want those resources on those changes that are actually posing a risk to the business, that actually have a very high risk, and that's what we have here. So we'll complete this cab review using still insights and analysis from the kind of intelligence, the intelligence and analytics layer here. So we can see, for example, for the upcoming days, what changes we have scheduled. We can dive into specific changes and see those factors. As Joe introduced earlier, these are going to be different for every customer, right? But have a way to mitigate and manage risk as we plan around releasing these changes to customers. This is sort of the last step. We've got that high velocity, agile, and DevOps process that's being orchestrated, in this case, with that release pipeline that you saw earlier. We want this to be seamless and for that last step to go smoothly with low risk, with mitigated and managed risk. And you can use this sort of dashboard to drive that. And in this case, you do see some data sources outside of ITSM. Again, it's going to span boundaries, right? When we think about business outcomes and some of the really complex challenges we're trying to solve, those aren't going to fit squarely within the domain of DevOps or Agile or change enablement / ITSM. It's going to span boundaries. And in this case, you see the risk factors do as well, which is a natural and common result. So to connect it back here, we can see and kind of review a couple concepts that we've covered. So just as a reminder, we have this orchestration layer foundation. Now this is going to connect our value creation activities in our enterprise agile planning systems and our development systems, source control management, and it's going to, in a controlled, visible, integrated, and automated way, deliver that value out to customers and do that in a repeatable way that, again, is high velocity, low risk, high compliance, the kind of check marks and scores we want across the board. We're going to connect together the people, process, and tools involved in this. It's not just about the technical and engineering tooling, but being able to connect people and process as well. And when folks are involved, giving them great context so they can do their work effectively, whether that's a change management leader being able to manage risk with our change risk prediction system, or other stakeholders. We gave as an example earlier, kind of the QA stakeholder. So with that, hopefully you can see a couple interesting concepts about how we think about value stream orchestration, how we think about value stream intelligence, and importantly, how you can start to think about those in a connected way. So you can drive by design, sort of in an embedded, baked-in way, the outcomes that you're looking to achieve with a data-driven approach. With that, I'll turn it over to Jordan. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Neil. And thank you, everyone, for your questions during today's session. We're going to go ahead and get to those in just 1 minute. In the meantime, though, I do want to go ahead and open it up back to Joe, back to Neil, on whether either of you have any last parting thoughts before we get into questions from today's presentation.
Sure, I can close here. So thanks again. I'm sure I'll be answering some of the questions, but just wanted to connect kind of what Joe and I both covered. You know, our approach has, and what we recommend as a best practice, has a few key dimensions. First off, bring together systems. You know, our approach as a company is being source agnostic, but I think if you set the tools aside, seeing across the board, across different tool boundaries is critical when we talk about data, and when we talk about certainly things that rely on data, like good AI models for risk prediction and other applications. And then I think a couple other themes is, you know, bringing together people, process, and tools. You saw that conceptually with what Joe covered and how teams are tackling this kind of, in some way, sometimes bottleneck or challenging area of change management or change enablement, how teams are doing that by crossing people, process, and tools in this kind of seamless, integrated way. And finally, you know, the change enablement was a little bit of the focus today, thinking about how we kind of reduce CAB expenditures, or at least have CABs focus on the right areas, how we improve ITSM outcomes. However, that's going to be an integrated cross-domain approach and philosophy. It really needs to be. You need to be able to connect Agile to DevOps to change enablement to GRC to security to quality. And there are some kind of best practice ways to do that through orchestration and data.
All right, thank you, Neil. And actually, that kind of leads into one of our questions here that we have. And the question I have is around, are there ways to measure and manage risk earlier in the software delivery process before most of the CAB and ITSM activities?
So I can take that one, Jordan. Yeah, there is. You know, some of the ways that, you know, I'll speak from personal experience, I guess. Personally, and I suppose as a company, we're working with customers is, you know, you saw the kind of change enablement, that change risk perspective. We touched on it just very briefly, actually, in the demo, but we also looked at kind of this idea of quality risk. Where do we have pockets of issues, that, whether that's kind of static code issues that might be surfaced by static code analysis tools, or more conventional testing bugs, those sort of issues. There's risk that accompanies, you know, quality activities too, which are often earlier in the ITSM, or earlier than ITSM in kind of the life cycle. We can also start to think about things like the release management perspective, and also the security perspective, I think, are a couple other important ones to start with. So, you know, in our release system, you know, release solution, we have risk scoring that complements these others, right? So you can understand risk from multiple vantage points, from sort of the release management, from the change enablement, from the quality, and then the other example that I gave is security. So The nuances of particularly what those factors are will kind of depend on the organization, but whenever possible, you want to have data drive where to focus on. Even across those boundaries, perhaps it could be that quality risk or change risk really dwarfs risks that are kind of manifest earlier in the life cycle. So that's a couple thoughts, and certainly I see folks thinking about risk earlier in the life cycle. Yes.
And then moving on to the second question here. Joe, Neil, you both talked about kind of the evolving role of the Change Advisory Board, and they have a couple questions here around this, but this one I'm going to point, I think, at Neil, because I think it's a little bit specific to the demo. Within release, is that if a CAB review is still kind of required, kind of in your demo, is that a manual step to go ahead and mark that in release so it can kind of proceed?
That's a good question. Sort of depends, and I know that's not as exciting of an answer, but the nuance there is really organizational process and context. We want folks to use the process that's most efficient and makes the most sense, regardless what tools and people are involved in that. So let me give a couple examples. Yes, we can have a manual task that's completed in release related to the CAB if folks are in release and if the kind of stakeholders who are involved in orchestration are involved in those CABs. However, folks may want to just mark CAB activities in the ITSM system, something like ServiceNow, in which case we can watch with release, programmatically, automatically, ServiceNow records, and then once, let's say a record reaches a certain state, proceed with the release. So we've got flexibility, and I think which approach makes sense just depends a little bit on the context and what process people are most comfortable with.
All right, wonderful. And I have another question, kind of speaking of some of the integrations in the systems we do, and I suspect it's a customer question here, but the question is, and I'll leave it open, I think, to either of you. The question is, we don't have any other data sources integrated with change risk prediction today. Do they need to build those integrations before change failure prediction can use more than just their ITSM data?
Yeah. Hey, Jordan, this is Joe. I'll go ahead and take that. Thank you. The answer is that enterprises don't have to, using our tools, don't have to build new integrations to their IT service management system to enable change failure prediction to take advantage of those other sources. And in fact, the best practice for linking all the change-related data from all the various sources that may be disjointed today is to use an orchestration solution like the digital.ai release solution that Neil demonstrated, which is going to then collect and connect that data from all those various tools and associate them to the release and thereby to the change. And then that will allow, it sort of acts like a hub that will allow the change failure prediction solution to get all those connections. And that really is the key thing, is having some linkage. So, I mean, you could put all of the data together into a data warehouse, but if there's no way to actually navigate the data from the change ID back to, say, the bugs that were recorded in the testing or any of the other types of things, it's difficult, if not impossible, to actually use. And so that really is the key. And the good news is that the orchestration solution that you may already be using or likely are looking at will do that for you, and is actually the quickest, most efficient, and most valuable way to be able to enable change failure prediction to use all those connections. That said, as you heard me say earlier, change failure prediction almost always work great and drive a lot of value just using the data from the IT service management system. And then as you're able to add in and link more different tools and sources, oftentimes then it can get even richer and more robust in terms of both accurately predicting change failures and providing the deep end-to-end insights that you can use to really mitigate risk both on an individual change level and on a holistic value stream process level. Thanks, Jordan.
No, thanks, Joe. And hey, we just had a question come in. I think you just answered it, but just to kind of clarify, we just had someone ask, can they use the change failure prediction solution without Digital.ai release, or do they need both the change failure prediction solution and that kind of orchestration tool?
Yeah, and yes, I'm sorry. Yes, they can use change failure prediction without the release solution, and they can use the release solution without change failure prediction. The solutions are able to operate entirely independent of one another, but as we showed today, they also integrate really well and really provide more value, when you do that. But any of these things is a journey. You've got to start somewhere, and so starting with change failure prediction might be the right answer for one organization, and then over time evolving to, put the release component in, layer that in. That works. Totally also appropriate to start with release, and then layer in the change failure prediction. They're built and designed to allow you a lot of flexibility in what path you take that makes the most sense for you and your organization and your business.
All right, and then we have another kind of question on the same vein, again, and that's on whether or not this individual can programmatically integrate changes prediction in tools other than the Digital.ai release solution.
I guess I'll take that, and Joe, you may want to layer in some color too. Certainly release integration, I think, is a best practice. Certainly if you have release, of course, from both kind of the technical and non-technical perspective, it's plug and play, no code type approach. That said, the change risk prediction solution uses a data API to programmatically expose the metrics. So you can use your choice of REST API client, but using the release plugin specifically will allow you to do that in a really seamless, easy way and not have to worry about kind of coding anything.
Okay. Yeah, Neil, that I agree 100%. And the change failure prediction is set up to be able to pull in data from other solutions with pre-built adapters into a unified data model. So either way, they can programmatically integrate with tools other than release in both directions.
All right, wonderful. And then again, talking about some of that data that gets pulled in, and it's funny, it seems like we have one of these kind of questions on most of the webinars that we have. It's around kind of data quality. So the question is, Joe, I think we mentioned that the change failure prediction uses CMDB data. This individual's CMDB is still immature and has, their words, not mine, lots of data quality issues. Will the change failure prediction still work without that CMDB data?
Yep. Yes, it will. And this is, as you said, a really common question, not just about CMDB, in other words, configuration management database data, but about all sorts of different data and concerns and questions about the data quality. And so they're really kind of the key answer is that AI solutions, unlike almost all conventional solutions, don't need a fixed set of inputs because the AI actually looks through all of the inputs that we provide to it, and it figures out which ones are, help it understand, explain, and predict change failure in terms of how they relate to historic change failure patterns, and then to use that to construct a new unique algorithm for predicting change failure based on that historic data, in a customer by customer basis. And therefore, if the CMDB or any other data is great and it's really useful, it'll use it. If it's not, no problem. It'll leave it behind and use other data. So it's actually kind of to some extent kind of breaks the garbage in, garbage out, because the AI is smart enough to perceive which is garbage and which is actually useful information. And use the useful information and ignore the garbage. And then typically it can identify. Typically we are really good at extracting lots of data points about every change, dozens of data points about every change, even just from the service management data. And typically somewhere in there's enough gold that it can work with to generate high value, accurate change failure predictions. So thanks for that question, and it's an important one. And I'll say as an aside, I get to talk with a lot of people in their change processes around the industry, and I've yet to meet anybody who says that their CMDB is as good as it could be, and most people have a lot of concerns about it. And oftentimes that the AI does find some nuggets in there that it is in fact able to use. So you might be pleasantly surprised, and if not, no big deal.
All right, thanks, Joe. And I wanted to take just a second here. We are kind of approaching time for today's session. I wanted to thank everyone for submitting their questions. We're only going to have time for one or two more, but please feel free to continue to enter them into the Q&A panel. We are going to go ahead and do a follow-up with everyone over email because we are not going to be able to get to those questions today. So please continue to put those in and we will follow up directly over email. So, I have a handful of questions here kind of around the integration for it. So I'm going to throw kind of two of them out here at once. And it's kind of around the change risk prediction values. The first question are those values calculated in real time? The second part of this question is, can they see some of those predictions and some of those factors before the cap phase is reached in release? So a two-parter there.
So this is probably another one that I'll take, but Joe may layer in some color. So for the first one about real time, it's not real time. That said, it is configurable, like the frequency at which we extract and process data, and the AI model processes that. So that's configurable. And so we use kind of a best practice approach for that extraction frequency and the way that we execute the data pipelines. And really, when we think about kind of a full end-to-end process from value creation out to value being delivered, or even just the life cycle of a change, those of course don't go start to finish in a minute. So I haven't seen a case where we needed something faster or that we couldn't accommodate with the configurable frequency that we have. And the second question, can you remind me of the second question, Jordan?
Yeah, the second question is on basically getting access or visibility into those basically those change failure prediction metrics and some of those indicators prior to it reaching the cap phase within release.
Right. Yeah. So it's almost kind of a sister question to risk calculation before any ITSM activities from earlier. So yes, the change failure prediction you can look at. I mean, it's not calculated at the point of the cab. At the point of the cab is when you look at the values, and so just as soon as the relevant data is extracted and processed, that's when we're going to be able to provide those predictive values. Anything to layer on there, Joe?
Nope, you nailed it, Neil.
All right. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up today. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. And thank you, Joe and Neil, for walking us through such an informative session. If you'd like to learn more, you can go ahead and visit us at our website at digital.ai.